Hi, and welcome to today's current news. Today is Thursday, May 2nd, 2024. Paul Auster, prolific and experimental man of letters and filmmaker, dies at 77. Paul Auster, a prolific, prize-winning man of letters and filmmaker known for such inventive narratives and meta-narratives as the New York Trilogy and 4321, has died at age 77. Auster's death was confirmed by his wife and fellow author, Siri Hustvedt, who said that Auster died Tuesday at their home in Brooklyn. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer in 2022. The long, rich, often funny, intimate dialogue we had for decades is over, she said in a statement. But Paul continues to speak, and he continues to tell stories in books that have been translated into over 40 languages and are very much alive in me and in the readers who have loved his tales all over the world. Starting in the 1970s, Auster completed more than 30 books, from memoirs to novels to poetry. A longtime fixture in the Brooklyn literary scene, he never achieved major commercial success in the U.S., but was widely admired overseas for his cosmopolitan worldview and erudite and introspective style. He was named a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government in 1991. He was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize and voted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Called the Dean of American Postmodernists and the most meta of American meta fictional writers, Auster blended history, politics, genre experiments, existential quest, and self-conscious references to writers and writing. The New York Trilogy, which included City of Glass, Ghosts, and The Locked Room, was a postmodern detective saga in which names and identities blur, and one protagonist is a private eye named Paul Auster. The brief travels in the scriptorium, wraps a story inside of a story, as a political prisoner finds himself compelled to read a series of narratives by fellow victims that will eventually include his own. He was a wonderful storyteller. In the postmodern vein, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Richard Powers said Wednesday, "He would take you through all these twists and turns and loops and still make you keep reading." The author's longest and most ambitious work was 4321, published in 2017 and a book finalist. The 800-page novel is a tale of quadraphonic realism in the post-World War II era. The parallel journeys of an Archibald Isaac Ferguson from summer camp and a high school baseball to student life in New York and Paris during the mass protests in the late 1960s. Identical but different, meaning four boys with the same name parents, the same bodies, and the same genetic material, but each one living in a different house, in a different town, with his own set of circumstances. Auster writes in the novel, each one on his own separate path, and yet all of them still the same person. Three imaginary versions of himself, and then himself thrown in as number 4 for good measure, the author of the book. His other works include the nonfiction compilations Groundwork and Talking to Strangers, a family memoir, The Invention of Solitude, a biography of novelist Stephen Crane, the novels Leviathan and Talking to Strangers, and the poetry collection White Space. In his most recent novel, Wogmongarter, the title character is a widowed professor haunted by mortality and asking himself where his mind will be taking him next. Auster was so much the old-fashioned author that he worked on a typewriter and disdained the email and other forms of electronic communication, but he did have an unusually active film career compared to his writing peers. In the mid-1990s, Auster collaborated with director Wayne Wang on the acclaimed art house film Smoke, an adaptation of Auster's humorous story about a Brooklyn cigar shop and a certain customer named Paul. The film starred Harvey Keitel, Saoirse Channing, and William Hurt, among others, and brought Auster an Independent Spirit Award for Best First Screenplay. Wang and Auster quickly followed Smoke with Blue in the Face, an improvised tale which returned to the Brooklyn cigar store and again starred Keatle, along with appearances by everyone from Lou Reed to Lily Tomlin. Auster eventually made the movies himself. Keatle was featured in Lulu on the Bridge, a love story released in 1998 that Auster directed and co-wrote with Vanessa Redgrave. 9 years later, Auster wrote and directed the drama, The Inner Life of Martin Frost, starring David Thewlis as a novelist and Irene Jacob as the woman with an uncanny connection to the story he's been writing. The 4 times I've worked on movies, I've never had a problem talking to actors, Auster told director Wims during a 2017 conversation that ran in Interview magazine. I always felt in great harmony with them. It was after those experiences that I realized there's a similarity between writing fiction and acting. The writer does it with words on the page, and the actor does it with his body. The effort is the same. Auster married Husvit in 1982 and had a daughter, Sophie, who appeared in The Inner Life of Martin Frost. He also had a son, Daniel, from an earlier marriage to the author-translator Lydia Davis. Daniel Auster would struggle with drug addiction and die of an overdose in 2022. Shortly after being charged with second-degree manslaughter in the death of his infant daughter, Ruby. Paul Auster never commented publicly on his son's death, but he had written often about parenthood in The Invention of Solitude, published in 1982. He reflected on the thousands of hours he spent with Daniel in the first 3 years of his life and wondered whether they mattered. It will be lost forever, Auster wrote. All these things will vanish from the boy's memory forever. Born in Newark, New Jersey, Paul Benjamin Auster grew up in a middle-class Jewish home torn between his father's thrift to the point of miserliness and his mother's urge to spend to the point of recklessness. He would soon feel like an outsider in his family, soared by their materialism and more inspired by James Joyce's Ulysses or the tales of Edgar Allan Poe than the security of a traditional job. His ideals would be well tested. After graduating from Columbia University, Auster struggled for years before he was able to find a publisher or earn money from his books. He wrote poetry, translated French literature, and worked on an oil tanker, attempted to market a baseball board game, and even thought of earning income by growing worms in his basement. All along, my only ambition had been to write. Auster wrote in a brief memoir, Hand to Mouth, published in 1995. I had known that as early as 16 or 17 years old. I had never deluded myself into thinking I could make a living at it. Becoming a writer is not a career decision, like becoming a doctor or a policeman. You don't choose it as much as get chosen. And once you accept the fact that you're not fit for anything else, you have to be prepared to walk a long, hard road for the rest of your days. UCLA clashes. Police criticized for delayed response to violence.
Counter-protesters showed up, as they have been doing for the last couple of days, to disrupt the encampment. They fired off fireworks towards the encampment, and that there's been tear gas used on site. Campus has requested a police presence from across the city. The encampment is organised by Students for Justice in Palestine. They've largely been protesting peacefully, but pretty much from the first evening they were there, overnight they've been harassed by increasingly large groups of counter-protesters. We're aware that it's over 100 this evening. In recent evenings it's also become increasingly violent.
The Office of California's governor has criticized the police response to violence on campus at the University of California, Los Angeles. A masked pro-Israeli group assaulted a pro-Palestinian student camp before officers were called to the campus. Governor Gavin Newsom's spokesperson said the limited and delayed police intervention was unacceptable. Hundreds of police officers were on campus and around the perimeter on Wednesday. State officials and university leaders have said they immediately deployed security personnel to the tent camp on Dixon Plaza when clashes erupted just before midnight on Tuesday. But several people on site said law enforcement had not acted quickly enough. Law enforcement simply stood at the edge of the lawn and refused to budge as we screamed for their help. UC Divest at LA, a group involved in the encampment, claimed in a statement. The BBC has contacted UCLA and LAPD for a response. Protesters started leaving the site roughly 2 hours after the attack began, and police had established control as day broke on Wednesday morning. Governor Newsom himself condemned the violence in a post on X, formerly Twitter, separate to his office's statement. The law is clear, he said. The right to free speech does not extend to inciting violence, vandalism, or lawlessness. He said those responsible must be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution, suspension, or expulsion. Citing law enforcement sources, the Los Angeles Times reports there were only a few UCLA police officers on hand, and they retreated because they were outnumbered by the crowd. According to the newspaper, reinforcements were called from California Highway Patrol and Los Angeles, and it took 3 hours to bring the situation under control. The overnight clash at one of America's top public colleges took place only hours after police in New York had raided and cleared a Columbia University building taken over by students. Protests at Columbia against the war in Gaza have inspired similar actions at universities, small and large, public and private, in more than 24 states, with activists demanding the institutions cut financial ties with Israel and companies profiting from the war. On Wednesday, Texas state troopers arrested 17 anti-war protesters at the University of Texas at Dallas, while the NYPD arrested at least 15 people at Fordham University in the Bronx. UCLA canceled classes on Wednesday as it sought to ease tensions on the central quad of its Westwood campus. The university declared the pro-Palestinian encampment in the shadow of its famed Royce Hall an illegal gathering on Tuesday. Pro-Israeli groups have held counter-demonstrations around the encampment in recent days, with the factions separated by a narrow buffer zone of barricades. Officials said they had expanded security presence in the area, but declined to disrupt what they acknowledged as largely peaceful demonstrations. Footage online shows that as midnight approached on Tuesday, a large pro-Israeli group donning black outfits and white masks arrived on campus and attempted to dismantle the barriers. Campers, some wearing goggles and helmets, and others carrying placards and umbrellas, rallied to defend their makeshift space. Tonight, they escalated to a whole new level. They started inciting violence, one pro-Palestinian student activist told the BBC. Dylan Winward, a reporter with the Daily Bruin, a student newspaper, said the counter-demonstrators have thrown objects, including fireworks, a scooter, water bottles, and tear gas. He said a university-appointed security team had withdrawn ahead of the clash as it believed it could no longer safely hold the buffer zone. The Bruin also said on social media that 4 of its reporters had been assaulted and sprayed with an irritant early on Wednesday morning by attackers who recorded the incident on their mobile phones. Mary Osako, a UCLA vice chancellor, said police and other first responders were called to the scene of its encampment over horrific acts of violence early on Wednesday morning. We are sickened by this senseless violence and it must end, she said. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass slammed the clashes as absolutely abhorrent and inexcusable. As night turned to day, a tight security cordon had cleared out the area, as a handful of protesters fortified their encampment. It remains unclear how many of the people involved in the nighttime chaos, particularly on the pro-Israeli side, are students at the university. The Los Angeles chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations blamed the violence on a mob of pro-Israel extremists. Jewish Federation Los Angeles, meanwhile, blamed the university's chancellor for allowing an environment to be created over many months that has made students feel unsafe. Pressure has been mounting on college leaders to rein in pro-Palestinian protests as they spread across the country. Earlier on Wednesday, New York City Mayor Eric Adams said several out of some 300 arrests at two New York campuses had been outside agitators. Away from his New York trial, Donald Trump's campaign rallies are business as usual. Donald Trump's first campaign rallies since the start of his criminal hush money trial in New York barely mentioned the reason for his absence from the campaign trial. But in lengthy speeches in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and Freeland, Michigan, Wednesday, Trump continued to escalate his rhetoric around what a second term would look like and the consequences he foresees if he doesn't win. Trump echoed comments he made in Time magazine interview that published earlier this week outlining an aggressive take on the presidency, including a push to revive the authority to withhold congressionally appropriated funds and give police further immunity from prosecution to crack down on immigrants and perceived crime hotspots. Many of his signature proposals and policies mentioned frequently at campaign events were on display, increasing oil drilling, a rollback of President Joe Biden's economic policies, including the Inflation Reduction Act and a massive bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. He also mentioned recent protests roiling college campuses around Israel's military action in Gaza in response to an October 7th attack on the country by Hamas. He called on those schools to vanquish the radicals and to take back our campuses for all the normal students, while making inflammatory remarks about refugees from the conflict as part of his hardline immigration views. In his Wisconsin speech, Trump implied Palestinian refugees resettled in the U.S. would bring jihad and warned of an October 7th style attack, as he reiterated his proposal to enact a travel ban from majority Muslim countries and vowed to oversee the largest deportation in the history of our country. Over the course of nearly 3 hours of speaking between the two rallies, very little time was spent mentioning the ongoing trial in New York, where yesterday Trump was held in contempt of court for violating a gag order against comments about witnesses and jurors in the case. In Wisconsin, Trump mentioned a crooked judge and the Georgia prosecutor overseeing a separate racketeering case stemming from a failed effort to overturn his 2020 election defeat, but largely reflected upon the polling boost and criminal charges brought him. In Michigan, Trump was more expansive with his displeasure. He decried a fake trial in New York and said the judge was unconstitutionally stopping him from speaking while arguing the multiple criminal cases against him. Bullshit. As you know, I have come here today from New York City, where I'm being forced to sit for days on end in a kangaroo courtroom with a corrupt and conflicted judge enduring a Biden sideshow trial at the hands of a Marxist district attorney, Soros-backed, who's taking orders from the Biden administration, Trump complained. The New York trial has sidelined much of Trump's ability to campaign and take advantage of earned media coverage through interviews, social media posts, and reactions to other news of the day. Bad weather forced the campaign to reschedule a rally on April 20th in North Carolina at the last minute. But time away from the trial has not changed. Trump's message or delivery in a race that he says will determine if the country survives. At the evening Michigan rally, Trump repeated stories about Mexico providing troops to patrol the border with the United States, hypothesizing war in Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East would never have happened if he was in charge, and warning that Biden winning in November would destroy the country. Should we reconsider having children due to fears about the climate crisis? Record-breaking heat, rising sea levels, increasingly extreme weather, and more are fueled by the human-made climate crisis. It doesn't feel like a great time to be raising children or having them in the first place. But maybe it still is, if we can counter fear with knowledge and hope. I chatted with Bill Wire, CNN's chief climate correspondent and host of the CNN original series, The Wonder List with Bill Wire, about these topics and about his new book, Life as We Know It, Can Be, Stories of People, Climate, and Hope in a Changing World. Written as an open letter to his own kids. Are you fundamentally an optimistic or pessimistic person by nature? Bill says, it depends on the day. I find that covering this beat, my mood is directly proportional to what I'm focused on. Some days it is a fire hose of peer-reviewed dread and just more signs of how many ways humanity is wrecking the planet. But the days when I focus on the problem solvers, the dreamers and doers, the folks who know that there's a better future, those days heal the soul. When I actually sat down to write this book, we were in a very dark place nationally, and I found enough positive stories. I saw enough momentum going the right way, that most days I wake up now with more wonder than worry. The fight has just begun, and so much can be saved, and so much is worth saving. That's the ethic I'm trying to pass down to my kids. To be clear-eyed about the challenges, but full of courage and hope for the solutions. Alan says, on one hand, you wrote, the United States of America I knew and loved is gone. Eaten from the inside, its metastatized lies fed to furious people in forgotten places. On the other hand, you intentionally had a child in the last few years. What would you say to someone who feels conflicted about having a baby right now? Wire says, I would say we need all the good help we can get. And if you believe that your child is going to be a net positive for humanity, go for it. I think our basic purpose in life is to procreate. Nature wants replication and hopefully improvement for the next generation. It's a very first world problem to think about whether or not you have children. It's tough for people, and I totally understand the psychology around this sort of thing, because we haven't really come to grips with the mental stress of climate change. We haven't processed through the 5 stages of grief, as they pertain to the climate, to realize what we've lost, and we have to reach acceptance to what we need to build in order to survive and thrive. There are family counselors who deal with parents who are in the grips of this grief. They still want to expand their family, but are so worried about what the future might bring. I think that's a valid concern. And there was a time when I completely understood where those folks were coming from. But I'm so glad my little boy is here. He gives me inspiration that I otherwise might not have. He gives me perspective. I think that I'm a believer that humans can be a net positive for the planet, and most people want to be. And it really comes down to the stories we tell ourselves. Alan says, young people are worried about the climate. Some 84% of 10,000 people ages 16 to 25 years old across 10 countries were either moderately or extremely worried about climate change. According to a 2021 survey published in The Lancet Planet Health, more than 50% in the study said they felt sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty about it. And more than 45% said their feelings on the topic negatively affected their daily life and functioning. You cite a similar study in your book. What would you say to these teens and young adults? Or what do you say because your daughter is in that age range, right? Wire says, she's 20. Well, I say sorry to begin with. We're sorry our intended and unintended consequences have scrambled their futures. They can't take for granted the things that I took for granted. Air, water, temperature, how you build shelter, how you grow food. They don't have the luxury of ignoring those things. My dad used to say to me, anytime I had problems, good thing you're tough. So I feel like we have to raise a generation of resilient children and model for them what that looks like. We have to be constantly vigilant about unexpected, unnatural disasters, and we have to talk to each other in communities about these sorts of things. I think a big reason for these spikes in climate anxiety in these polls are the result of us not talking about it. The result of adults not having honest conversations about what we're losing, what's worth saving, the decisions we have to make, because there are no easy decisions anymore. We have to do brutal math on what is worth saving and what is worth letting go. I think it's only through these conversations we get through the 5 stages of climate grief and reach the end of that, which is acceptance. Alan says, I love this detail about the birth of your son, River. that he was conceived in a lighthouse during the pandemic. It's the perfect metaphor, a beacon of light, of hope in the darkness. To carry that metaphor just a bit further, another feature of lighthouses is that they are built to withstand the worst of nature and are often isolated to the point that they need to be self sufficient. Are self sufficiency and fortitude virtues you think parents need to put greater emphasis on now? Wire says yes, absolutely. My dad was a bit of a misanthrope who loved to be alone, and he raised me with that sense of John Muir romanticism about living in a cabin in the woods. But John Muir was using an axe that was made in a factory somewhere by other people who didn't have the luxury of going off the grid. We need everybody. We need all the hands on deck together these days. In terms of teaching resilience and independence as a personality trait, I think that it is vital. But I want my kids to be plugged into their communities, to be civically engaged, too, to know their power as citizens and conscious consumers, to be the kind of neighbor who makes everyone around them stronger, come what may. Alan says, I have 2 children myself, ages 12 and 16, and when I talk to them about the climate crisis, I find myself trying to spin it a bit, to counteract the doom with optimism of reversing the course that we're on, of government action, scientific breakthroughs, stories of people making change. How do we find that balance in daily conversation with our kids of being honest but not hopeless? Wire says, it's trying to strike that balance all the time. The best advice I ever got for leading a climate beat in this part of my life came from Mr. Rogers, who famously said anytime he saw a scary event on television, his mother told him to look for the helpers. There are always helpers rushing into the scene, and this book is dedicated to the helpers, not just to the first responders that I meet in these disaster zones, but the countless folks living lives of quiet service and moving us in a more positive direction. The helpers lift me up. The idea that the same frontal lobes that built the problem as we exploded as a species can solve them once we come together. There's so much that can be done, but there's so much that can be saved. Thank you for joining me today. Have a great day.